like to acknowledge that we meet together on Indigenous country, unceded Indigenous land, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. The acknowledgement of country is a very, very important protocol, and I do it with that in mind, but I also wanted to stress how important it is to reach beyond just reciting those words and to commit to engaging in Indigenous perspectives and knowledges. And some of you may know that this week universities around Australia are also committing to work around the Uluru Statement from the Heart. I believe that there are some stalls around the university that you may be able to see, and I look forward to our school and the university continuing to contribute to that work and learning from Indigenous perspectives. So thank you very much for coming today. My name is Professor Gelber and I'm the Head of the School of Political Science. It is turned on. Can you not hear me properly? I'll move it a bit more close. There you go. My name is Professor Gelber and I am the Head of the School of Political Science and International Studies. We have an excellent panel here today made up of, to my immediate left, Professor Bronwyn Fredericks, who's the Pro-Vice-Chancellor Indigenous Engagement at the University of Queensland. Associate Professor Nicole George, who is the Director of the HDR program and an Associate Professor who does a lot of work on gender and politics in our school. Then we have Rachel Nolan. Rachel Nolan is a former MP, a parliamentarian from Queensland, who is now the Director of the McKell Institute. And then at the end we have Dr. Kefford, who is a current DECRA Fellow in our school and lectures and researches in the area of Australian political parties and campaigning. So I'm going to move to the speakers in a moment. Just before I do, I wanted to acknowledge that some of the topics that come up today that you may find confronting or difficult. The university has a number of support services in place for both staff and students, and there's a link to several of them. The First Responder Network, which is a network of staff who are happy to provide referrals and point you in the right direction if you need better support. The Employee Assistance Program, which is available to all staff and their families for free counselling, and also the Sexual Misconduct Support Unit. And so I'd encourage anybody who has any questions or needs any support to reach out to those organisations. So the format today is that I'm going to be asking the panellists some questions to start, and then after that we will move into Q&A from the audience. So if you have any questions, please indicate by raising your hand. I'm probably going to ask each panellist about 2 questions in the beginning, and just so you have an idea of when we're going to move into the Q&A from the audience. So I will start. I'll start with Rachel. As a former Member of Parliament yourself, what do you have to say about what recent revelations, and there seem to be new revelations every day, mean for women in politics in Australia?
Like everyone, I'm totally horrified by what appears to be unravelling day by day in Canberra, and it's completely different from my own experience. So I hate the idea that people will watch this stuff and think this is the normal experience or the experience to be expected by women who get themselves involved in Parliament. I was elected in 2001, so it's 20 years ago now. I was 26. I was at that time the youngest woman ever to have been elected to the state parliament. And Queensland at that time, after that election, had the 3rd highest proportion of women in the parliament of any parliament in the world. So it was sort of 45% or something like that. I won't say that my experience was one of having a sense of absolute equality. Certainly there were experiences of that thing that women talk about of you're in the meeting and you say something and no one appears to hear it. And then a man repeats your idea and is greeted with a sort of, what a clever chap he is. So there were undoubtedly instances of what we now think of, we didn't at the time, as unconscious bias. Absolutely, there was that stuff. But last night, Nicole and I were just chatting about this. Karen Andrews Andrews, a federal minister, said on the 7:30 report that she didn't feel that she could go out and socialise at the Parliament. She didn't, and as a result, she felt sort of out of the loop. You know, she wasn't out of this. Women weren't involved in the social discussion. That was completely contrasting to my experience. When I was elected, it was a few years after Labor had introduced quotas. There was such a high proportion of women in the Queensland Parliament because it was a Labor landslide. And I absolutely felt, as a young woman, that there was always a view, not just that I had the right to be in the room, but that it was a good thing that I was in the room. So my recollection of being in Parliament was that it was by and large a tremendous experience of doing good things with good people, which is, in my view, what it should be.
Thank you. The next question is to Bronwyn. Recent revelations suggest a new moment of awareness of the gendered nature of Australian politics. But there are some issues that extend beyond gender that continue to be unaddressed in our political system. Can you please speak to us about that?
They kind of intersect in part with gender. And I will say that while people around me, whether it's here in the university, in the community, even getting shopping, seemed a bit shocked by what has been happening in Canberra, I want to say that this happens every single day to women, and in higher degrees for Indigenous women, women of colour, migrant women, refugee women, and other women in this community and other communities across the country. That what is happening in Parliament, in a sense, who are the women? Who are the women's spokeswomen? And it is disappointing, more than disappointing, that's what my shock is, in regards to it takes white women again, Anglo-Saxon women again, to get up and talk when Aboriginal women and other women, Indigenous women, non-Indigenous women, in terms of women of colour, have been speaking about issues over and over and over again and don't get heard. The fact that in that week that there was alleged rape in Parliament House, there was 3 deaths in custody, including 1 woman. The fact that Indigenous women are the highest rate of women incarcerated in this country, and that is escalating. Where are the voices of Anglo-Saxon women about that? Where are the voices in regards to the change in the Northern Territory Parliament yesterday in regards to the bill that will result in overturning of people on orders and result in more Indigenous women and other women in prison? Where is that? Where are the voices happening there? I'll also say, when we talk about women in Parliament, and women and the highest number of women in whether it's Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria, whatever, who are those women? Because it's not Indigenous women. There are now a couple, but at the time when Rachel and others were getting elected, when we saw increases in women into Parliament in Queensland, in this state, previously, there weren't Indigenous women. There wasn't women of colour there. So who are the women? I want you people to start looking at that, and that's replicated not just in Parliament, it's replicated across government, it's replicated across the DGs. Look at the DGs in Queensland, look at the First Assistant Secretaries nationally. Who picks them? How do they get those jobs? Look at the companies, the top 200 companies in Australia. Look at the big businesses, banks and institutions, and we are in a university today. Look at the 39 Vice-Chancellors, folks. Okay, look them up. Yes, there are women in the last 15, 17 vacancies that we've had in the last 18 months or so. There have been men and women, not one woman of colour, not one Indigenous woman Vice-Chancellor, not one Indigenous man Vice-Chancellor. But I wanted to raise that because this is broader than that. And for Australia, the issues relate back to our colonial history, where those people, white men and white women, were party to what was happening to Aboriginal people, both men and women, dehumanised, murdered. The processes of colonisation in terms of rape and sexual assault at that time have continued to now. Okay. I want people to start thinking about beyond the group as women.
Thank you, Bronwyn. Nicole, your work, you do a lot of work on gender, especially in the region, and you do look at intersections like that. What do you think that these recent allegations of sexual assault and other types of, I guess, gender behaviour, gender-informed behaviour, tell us about the environment in the federal parliament?
Thanks, Kath. I want to, I think Bronwyn made some really important points there, and I want to pick up on them in my second question. But just to say something, I think it's really interesting at the moment. Maybe if I could get you to show my first slide there. Excellent. Yeah. Come with a couple of pictures. It's really interesting that people keep talking about the parliamentary culture. We've got to change the parliamentary culture. I find that really wishy-washy and vague and unspecific. I think we have to talk about what is actually happening in the way the lawmaking environment is being shaped in this country. And I think what we see is an informal sort of rule operating in this environment that diminishes the standing of women. It diminishes and devalues the standing of women in electoral politics. So I think what we can determine is an unwritten rule that shapes the gendered life of political institutions, and particularly on the conservative side of politics, we see that at the moment. So take a look at this image of Scott Morrison swearing in his cabinet. He looks very proud of the fact. He often says he's appointed more women to the cabinet than any other Prime Minister. And he has, by a sliver of a percent, beaten the proportion of women that were in Kevin Rudd's ministry, but it's still only 30%, right? 30% of those cabinet posts are held by women. But if we look beyond the numbers, I think we see something even more sort of revealing. So look at the bottom picture over here of Scott Morrison talking to the Parliament and his front bench, sitting behind him, all men. So, we can ask ourselves, even when we have women in the cabinet, women in positions of power in government, do we hear their voices? I have to say, when I look at that photo, I see a number of quite poor politicians, I would say, quite poor political representatives. I won't name names. But where are the talented women? They are there, but they are out of the frame, literally. We never hear their voices. If you think about who fronts government communications, who are ministers, that we hear all the time, they're always the men, even though there are some women in high-profile positions. Maurice Payne, Minister for Foreign Affairs, Linda Reynolds, Minister of Defence. We only hear from her when she's in trouble. So, I think there's a really interesting marginalisation of women's voices in this government. If we could go to the next slide, why does it happen? It actually is indicative of a kind of really long-standing tradition in liberal political thought that dates back to the classical period. If you've ever read a book by Mary Beard called Women in Power, you will understand what I'm talking about. If you haven't, it's a fantastic read, really short little book. And she talks about the ways in which women who try to speak in classical times are mocked and devalued, told to be silent, compared to yapping dogs, compared to cows that moo, depicted as women who want to be men but are not as successful as men and so fail. So women can never speak in their own right. And I would argue that what we see today is that tradition carrying forward, despite all the formal reforms that we have put in place to bring women, and I agree with you absolutely, not women in the diversity that reflects what we see in the population, but to allow certain classes of women into the institution of politics. We have had formal reforms that allow those women to participate, and sometimes they're successful. But the informal rules that devalue the standing of women in politics still apply. And I think we only have to think about the symbolism of what we have seen in the last few days, the sickening symbolism of young men, male staffers, masturbating on the desk of a female cabinet minister or a young woman raped in the office of a female cabinet minister, I'm actually getting quite emotional talking about this, but that symbolism says to me that this rule is still in place and it is punishing those women who dare to have the ambition to have the same political power as men. So that's what I think is what is happening in our lawmaking environment at the moment. And I think, you know, how do we tackle a rule that is unwritten? You know, because women, to call out that rule, what they have to say is, I have been punished, and they have to talk about all the shaming behaviour that they've experienced. So that is a really hard thing to do.
Thank you. That segues nicely into the next question, which actually is about the formal rules that intersect, I'm sure, in practice, intersect with the informal rules by having something like a quota. You don't just change the formal situation, you also change the way in which people understand the situation and why the quotas might be needed. But to Glenn, we know that women and other underrepresented groups like Indigenous peoples and people of colour are significantly underrepresented in Parliament. What processes do the parties use, if any, to try and redress those problems? And what has shown to be effective in addressing underrepresentation?
To go to Rachel's point and your experience of the quotas in the Labor Party, Labor's the only party in Australia which really has a formal mechanism in place to address gender underrepresentation. It's effectively a 40% quota rule. There's all sorts of clauses in the Constitution. There's about 10 of them. They've changed them a few times. But they've done a pretty good job overall in pre-selecting at least 40% of women and also getting 40% of women into parliaments. The coalition parties have no formal mechanism in place, and you can see the result of this, sort of 25%, 30% of representatives being women, and the Greens actually don't have a formal mechanism either. They have gender equity policies embedded into their constitution, and they've generally done a pretty good job of meeting equity along gender lines. In terms of what's been shown to work internationally, the evidence is abundantly clear. There's now thousands of studies that have been done, some which have looked at hundreds of parties, 40 or 50 democracies, and what it shows is targets don't work, goals don't work, thoughts and prayers don't work. The only thing that works is a quota.
Thank you. And moving more broadly back to Bronwyn, you've already asked us to listen. That's vitally important, to listen to people of colour, to listen to women of colour, to listen to Indigenous people, and to listen to the stories that have already been told without asking people to tell them and retell them and retell them. But what else can we do at this point in time? This is a moment that it would be good to try and achieve some concrete change from. What else can we do to move forward?
I think people need to not continue, for Indigenous women specifically, not continue to see us as an equity group, number one. We come into the equity group purely because of the disadvantages created in society that places us there. First and foremost, Aboriginal and Torres Strait people are the First Nations people of this continent and needed to be treated in that regard as the First Nations people of the continent, who have some equity issues because of the way society manifests. I think if I speak to the women in this audience, all the women in this audience, when you are mouthing and speaking and talking about women specifically and broadly, I want you to think about who and which women you are talking about. Because necessarily you are grounding it in your positionality. As a white woman, or a refugee woman, or a woman of colour, migrant woman, an international student, however you are grounding that positionality. And think of other women as well. Think of other women too. Because often we see the quotas, when we go back to the pictures of who the women are and who the men are. From my perspective, looking at that, and I'm talking individually now, and in terms of what some of the literature tells me and what some other Indigenous women tell me, When the processes go through and white women position themselves first in equal positioning with white men, they actually centre themselves as white women. And all that does is bolster white supremacy. It bolsters white supremacy and sets all the dynamics in action yet again. So think about others, talk, advocate, speak up about the position of others. The other thing is get involved in other people's issues that aren't just about your own. The fact that just up here, there's an Uluru Statement stall today. The university has a week of action. I don't wear hearts because I just love wearing hearts every day. I'm wearing hearts because I'm campaigning for the Uluru Statement, because I want the constitution in this country changed, fundamentally changed, to be enshrined with an Indigenous voice that speaks to our parliament. I do not want a voice to government. Just a simple yet advisory group yet again. I want truth-telling, I want treaty, but I want a voice to parliament. I want changes about how the election process happens. I want pre-selection changed. I'm going to share here that in the 2000s, early 2000s, I was living in regional Queensland, that I did go around and talk to different political parties. I was considering a political career or moving into politics, becoming a candidate. Between the sexism and the racism and all the other isms that take place in rurality and regional Queensland, I also got basically told that, you know, I either copped some of it and continued with my aspirations, or I didn't, but I still helped. I still sold raffle tickets, and I still went to meetings, and I still helped at functions, and all of those things. Well, I chose not to do any of that. I chose to walk. And I think how many other women, whether they're Indigenous women, non-Indigenous women, migrant women, all kind of women, have chosen to do that. So in terms of people who are connected to political processes, look at your own mechanisms. Look at the mechanisms not just about sexism and gender, but look at the mechanisms that are at play in regards to racism, classism, all the other things that come into play. I saw a horrific incident between a union official and also a woman from a Samoan background. And some of us Indigenous mob in that town travelled out to go and support her, and she also left the political party she was attached to at that time. So, you know, it's broader than what people think. Okay? I'll also say that, and I'm taking on the words that was spoken in speaking out on the ABC last Friday night with Larissa Berent, Chelsea Bond, Associate Professor Chelsea Bond, who's working here at UQ, and additionally Amy Maguire, who's a PhD student here at UQ, but additionally a fabulous journalist and writer. And they spoke about centering Indigenous women, because when you centre Indigenous women and the experiences of Indigenous women, then all the other things seem to make a bit more sense. The other thing is Indigenous women skew the women's data. So it is our data that also skew it. So when you address those that are most marginalised, collectively I'm talking about, not me as an individual who's privileged as a professor in one sense, but you know, lives with all the other stuff, is that when you centre Indigenous women, then some of the other things start to unpack. When you look at the sovereignty of Indigenous women in this country, then things become unpacked. Okay? And also read up on the work of Aileen Morton Robinson, who wrote the book Talking Up to the White Woman 20 years ago. She just launched a 20-year anniversary book through UQP. It is available here on campus. So thank you.
Thank you. I'll move back to Rachel now. Possibly around the time that you were elected to the Queensland Parliament, I remember, or maybe earlier, I'm getting old now, I remember distinctly that when I was the age my son is now, I truly believed that by the time I reached this age, that things would be better, that there'd be a generational shift. I was confident in my generation. I was confident that we would change things. And I have to say that the events of the last few weeks, well, all kinds of events, but these ones in particular have just made me wonder about, obviously time is not the solution. We can't just rely on each successive generation somehow to become more progressive, because evidently they're not. Some are, but some are not. So do you have any concrete experiences of things that might have worked or would work to make things better?
I do, and I agree with your observation. I hadn't imagined that, I'd be having this conversation 20 years after I was elected quite the way that we are. And I agree with Bronwyn's observations as well. The first thing, so I'm into the mechanisms of change. How do you actually, great, we all in our hearts want it to be better. How do you go about doing that? The first thing is that you have, quite frankly, got to want for it to change. And that is not, in my view, a universal experience now. Indeed, there is a very significant partisan division in this country about the extent to which there is a desire for change. I think when we talk about it just as a sort of universal all-women issue, we fail to acknowledge where there has been change and where there has been regression. So it used to be that it was sort of controversial just to talk about gender issues. It's also controversial and a bit difficult to talk about partisan issues. Right now, in the federal parliament, in the lower house, 43% of the Labor caucus are women and 20% of the Conservative caucus are women. So first thing, do you want there to be a change? What's happened, I think, in Australia is that there used to be a higher degree of consensus around that than there is now. In Australian politics, the Conservatives pioneered women's representation. And then as we've had this sort of American-style shift to the right, we've gotten figures like Tony Abbott who have been opposed to more power for women. So first thing, you've got to want change. Second question, how do you go about it? And Kat's question specifically is, what have you seen that has worked? I've seen two things that have worked. Glenn talked about quotas. They work, everybody knows they work. It is dead set as simple as that. This is not rocket science. You either want to make the change and impose the quota or you don't, and if you don't, you should be judged for that. Bronwyn made the point, quite rightly, that when I first went into Parliament, there were no Indigenous MPs, and in Queensland there had been one ever. In my first term in the Parliament, there was a parliamentary inquiry called Hands on Parliament that asked the question, how do you change this? I was a part of that parliamentary committee. This might actually have been when we met. We went out and, all white people, but we went out and consulted on the question. And we looked at quotas and other mechanisms. The upshot of it was not that any quotas or other mechanisms were introduced, but that the conversation highlighted, at least to the Labor Party, the criticality of the issue. There are now 3 Indigenous members of the Queensland Parliament, 3 out of, I think, 91. They are all Labor MPs, 2 of them are women. So there is progress. There is not enough progress, but this is the example of the other mechanism. That is that you don't set a quota, but you make it a priority for action. You go out, you identify people, you ask them to become involved, you provide opportunities, and you actively provide a pathway, which is the exact opposite of Bronwyn's earlier experience, shamefully. Both of these things work, but first you have to want to.
Thank you. Over to Glenn. This seems like a possibly transformative moment, but we've been at possibly transformative moments before. Is there potential for this moment not to achieve the change that many of us hope it might?
Here comes the killjoy. Yeah, absolutely. I think there is. I think if we just look at the dynamics and the history of Australian politics, we can see why that is. There's lots of reasons for that, but if we look at movements which have emerged and been moderately successful in Australia, eventually they crash up against the rocks of party politics, right? And that's what we've been seeing in the last month. And the comments by the Prime Minister yesterday about considering a quota are interesting. They're new comments, they contradict previous statements. But I think we need to see a little bit more than talk, and even the idea of the Liberal Party introducing quotas, it's not something he can simply do himself. It's a federal party. Each of the state divisions of the Liberal Party needs to change their constitution. Then the federal division needs to change their constitution. And these are membership organisations, and there will be significant opposition within the Liberal Party to change the constitution, right? So is the Prime Minister and is the Liberal Party in particular going to make those changes in the run-up to an election and potentially deal with a rift inside their party? Again, this is where the dimensions of Australian party politics intersect with movements and present real challenges to achieve significant change, whether it's on this issue or any others. And we see this time and time again.
Thank you. The last question for our panellists goes to Nicole, and it revisits where we started. That is, even if we were able to, with or without quotas, achieve having more women in electoral politics, what would this do to the gendered rules that shape institutional politics more broadly in Australia?
Well, I think, just bringing more women into any institution doesn't fix the problem. It doesn't change the rules. We talk about add women and stir. If the rules are still in place and we haven't identified them and we haven't worked out how to challenge them, the position for women remains extremely difficult. We only have to look at things like, the challenge of changing highly masculinized institutions like the military in this country. With the effort to recruit more women, we just see more women in more insecurity often, because again, unwritten rules. People love to talk about culture. We've got to stop talking about culture. We've got to talk about explicit unwritten rules, identify them, find out how they're implemented and enforced by people with power, and deal with them. We have to be specific about this insidious presence of these unwritten rules. So the first question is, the first answer I would say is, unless we deal with that, we don't create a situation that is safe for women. But I want to return also to the important points about, it's not only more women, it's which women. I think if we had seen a more diverse representation of women generally in the parliament, but also in the government, we might have seen a much better response from this government. It's until political leaders understand that they actually benefit from diversity. If they don't understand that it's actually politically beneficial for them, things won't change. So the question about which women are part of this cohort that we want to bring into political representation, I think is really important. And I've just got some figures here on the diversity of our federal parliament, and it is fairly limited. There are 3 Aboriginal women in the parliament, and I'm talking about the House of Reps and the Senate together, and some other, a couple of other women of diverse sort of ethnicity. So I would say, my quick calculations, and don't quote me on this, anyone might have to do a bit more study, but I sort of found 3.5% of women with non-European background across the 2 chambers of our national parliament. This seems perversely out of step with the kind of Australia we see that we move around in, right? Perversely out of step. So why is that, and what can we do to change that? I think, we might need to look across the Tasman and see the incredible progress they've made on the diversity of their political representation and their House of Parliament. There are 7 reserved seats for the Maori population, something for us to reflect on. I I'm not sure I'd be interested to hear Bronwyn's thoughts on reserved seats. The last national election brought 48 women into the chamber, so that was the 2020 election. 15 were of non-European origin, so that's 12.5% of the chamber. Notably, 10% of the new members of Parliament identify as LGBTQI also, making the New Zealand Parliament also I'm quoting someone here, the queerest in the world. So I mean, how interesting, right? It can be done. What about also thinking about women in positions of power in this Parliament? What a fantastic appointment made by Jacinda Ardern to appoint the first Maori woman, Nanania Mahuta, as Minister for Foreign Affairs. So I think, there is progress, really significant progress being made on these questions. Disappointingly, how was that reported here in Australia? Everybody focused on Honourable, nobody on the skill and incredible accomplishments she'd already sort of achieved to be in that position. She was exoticized as this kind of tokenistic appointment. So I was hugely disappointed about that. And I think this again points to the institutional challenges that women from diverse backgrounds will face in a context where the rules of the game continue to serve the interests of those whose political presence is normalised, and by that I mean the white men. I'm hopeful that the scales are falling from our eyes in this country, but as I keep saying, unless we really call out these rules and we have women amongst us who are brave enough to talk about, and we've seen it happening, we've started to see it happening, but you have to actually talk about the poor treatment, the discrimination and the marginalisation that you have experienced through the enforcement of these unwritten rules. And that's really not an easy thing to do. And unless we do it, we're not going to see a change. And I don't think bringing more women in is just going to solve the problem. That isn't.
Thank you. Does anybody want to make sense?
I do. Because more women doesn't do anything. And I've got example after example how I can put that up, whether it's in government, whether it's in the NGO, non-government sector, whether it's in universities. The position of Aboriginal women and Aboriginal men stays the same. The position of people of colour stays the same. So it doesn't, I put this ring on earlier, this little one, not the big heart one, because I've got to give it to my niece and I found it in my house this morning. But it's a unicorn, and I continually remind her that you can't put all your hopes on a unicorn, and you can't put it all about that, because it doesn't change things. Nothing changes. So, and as I said earlier, having more white women who are equal with white men is just having more, it bolsters white supremacy in another format. And the actual Discrimination Commission have estimated the figure at 5% of only non-Anglo-Saxon in terms of our government, banking, institutions, universities. There was a really great little snappy paper in the New York Times about 18 months, 2 years ago, that's why, something about why the leadership in Australia is always still so white. I can't remember the exact headline, but it's something around that. But it came out of a paper from the Discrimination Commission. At the same time, there was a report on, the Aztec companies in Australia, and that's called Beyond the Pale. So this issue is coming up over and over about how the Australian leadership across the board, Parliament is a microcosm of it, is actually not representative of the Australia that we walk around every day, unless you're walking around with blinkers on. Okay? It is not representative of the everyday experience that people have when they go out of their house, or they come to university or go to work, unless you may work, and some of our people do in community, and live in an Aboriginal family, work in Aboriginal organisations, sit in the car with Aboriginal kids and drive home. Unless you also go to a shop that's managed by Aboriginal people and all the other things, and you can't live in that microcosm. Some remote communities kind of essentially do, except for management. So, and other communities do. Some of the culturally diverse communities do. But I want people to think about that. How does it manifest? Why does it continue to manifest? And it builds on what Rachel's words are around people have to want it to change. You have to want it enough. You have to make it happen enough. Because at the end of the day, in an Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander sense, communities are just getting on with the business of being and doing and being strong in a whole range of ways, in the ways that they've been doing for generations. Okay? People will continue to run services, manage services, do what they've got to do, raise their kids, and we'll always be here. We've always been here and we're always going to be here. Other people are the ones that come and go.
Thank you. Can you please just join me first in thanking the panel very much for their contribution?